Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Flying and Eating. Today, let's go somewhere and do something, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.
Hey everyone, it's Adam here, and welcome to my American Presidential Library series. I am currently in my hometown of Chicago, Illinois, and behind me is the future site of President Barack Obama's Presidential Library. This site, which at the time I'm recording this, is set to open sometime later next year in 2025, so obviously that could kind of change. But I thought, in anticipation of this happening, it would be fun to go to all the previously existing presidential libraries, of which there are 13. This will be the 14th. We will do them in continuity order by seniority of president, and we'll just talk all about them. They are kind of a rare thing, kind of spaced throughout the country, and as this series goes, you'll learn more and more about each one of these presidents. Our Presidential Library Tour series continues in Austin, Texas, with that of the 36th President of the United States, the 6th Presidential Library, Lyndon B Johnson. Chip, as one who has made Austin your adopted home, are you excited to learn all about the 36th President of the United States? Let's do it. So the building here is an interesting design. I know that Lyndon Johnson was heavily involved in it. They built it outside where the Longhorns, it's a college team and all that play, is also next to the Lyndon Johnson, there's a school there. Outside the campus here, this is towards the exit, we'll show you this now. They actually have a statue of the 36th President of the United States. I don't know how accurate this is to his height. I know he was a very tall man. So yeah, this might have been accurate. It's horrifying to look at. Also, obviously, we're going to upgrade our presidential passport. So when you first get inside, there's security. You buy your tickets over there. You also see one of LBJ's cars. This limo was one of the presidential limousines used mostly for post-presidency. And it mostly was driven around the ranch, which maybe we'll go take a look at later. Lyndon Johnson actually would drive it, which is something they no longer allow former presidents to do. A lot of the rules changed during the Reagan administration. They rewrote a lot of the former president rules about what former presidents can and can't do. So Lyndon Johnson would not have liked that. We did it. We got the Lyndon Johnson stamp, which, by the way, in this case, you actually get it stamped inside the gift shop, which is technically the exit, but you can go there first and do it. So past the hallway, we are introduced to Lyndon Johnson. They have an introduction to who he was, which is basically the movie, which we're probably going to skip. All right, so just for clarification, we are on the 3rd floor currently. The 3rd floor, the 4th floor, and usually the 10th floor are accessible. Unfortunately, temporarily, the 10th floor is closed for renovations. It's where they have a recreation of his Oval Office and everything. However, what makes his Oval Office recreation unique is you can't sit there and like touch stuff, because his actually is all the original components from his actual Oval Office, unlike some of the other libraries where you can actually go sit there, take a photo, that type of thing. It's hit or miss. Some libraries let you do it, some don't, but his has original stuff, so that makes perfect sense. But unfortunately, that means I cannot show that to you in this video, but it does exist. On this side, they have their temporary exhibit space, as most presidential libraries do. This one is specifically about Vietnam. We'll take a little bit of a look through that later, though. They have a Robo Johnson, so you can push this, and he comes to life.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very happy day here at the White House. We're glad you're present to join in these festivities with us and to share this pleasure. For some years, the ideal of our country...
I mean, it's just like a sentient, uncanny valley. It's creepy, but they also have a bunch of Lyndon Johnson artwork, you know, as he was depicted. He had such obvious accentuatable features, like his ears, his nose, etc., that he was very easy to make political cartoons out of. We come in and we see a quote from Lyndon Johnson that basically explains that every president wants to do what is right, but there's challenges that are involved in that. And so we're going to do this in a timeline order, starting with Lyndon Johnson in his earlier years. He was born out in basically Johnson, Texas, funny enough. And like his childhood home and all that stuff's out there. Maybe we'll show it to you guys later. He ends up living out there for a long time. And these are just some of the highlight events from when he was younger. Also, they have a random acknowledgement of the Titanic sinking, which is okay. But yeah, Lyndon Johnson, like, you can identify him as a baby even with his ears. Like, his ears always stood out, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just, you know exactly who he is. Those ears were iconic. But basically, it just goes over his early life growing up in rural America at the time. Now, Lyndon Johnson grew up very poor, but he wasn't really wanting for much. They did fine. As he gets older,
he basically starts traveling a bit, and he sees other parts of the United States and realizes there's parts of the country that have true poverty. And it kind of changes his mindset a bit, and he's like, this is wrong, this should change. And he basically gets in his own head that if he were ever in a position of power, he would make good, he would do right, and he would basically help people as much as he possibly could, which would eventually make him into what is known as the last of the New Deal Democrats. He eventually marries Lady Bird Johnson, which a lot of his friends thought was kind of an interesting choice, because Johnson was known as something of a playboy, and that didn't go away. Like, he's not thought of, Kennedy is often thought of as our playboy president. No, Johnson, very unapologetically, yeah, he did that a lot. But part of the reason he ends up with Lady Bird Johnson is her family had a lot of money, and they helped to fund his congressional run. He ends up succeeding at that in 1937 and becomes a representative of the state of Texas. They have show other major events. Actually, here's an interesting one. They talk about Jesse Owens.
Another bonus one, guys. Pluto's here, and we're now checking out the grave of Jesse Owens. Remember him?
Yeah, there's the bonus you guys weren't expecting. Anyway, it goes on to talk about World War II, obviously the attack on Pearl Harbor and all that sort of stuff, and Lyndon Johnson's involvement in that. His involvement in World War II was a little bit token. He basically did like one combat operation, but it was mostly seen as just kind of a PR stunt more than it was anything else. But that way it would allow him to have a Silver Star, which is what it's talking about, part of his campaign in the Pacific. But this, in hindsight, knowing what we know more about this was really, nobody else on that mission got it. He kind of only got it retroactively because he was, yeah. So I don't want to take away from his service. Anybody who serves has my respect. But his was a little, I don't know, it was celebrity treatment. Here they talk about Johnson's political rise and his family rise. Obviously, he gives birth, well, he doesn't personally give birth, obviously, Lady Bird does, to Lucy Baines Johnson, who I believe is still alive, actually, one of his daughters. He wins a Senate seat in 1948 to represent the state of Texas. And that was actually interesting for him because he had this great political hunger, and because of his time in Congress and just his personality, he was very, how do I put this, politically aggressive. He was very good at coming up to you, intimidating you, and saying, why don't you just vote my way? Why don't you should probably vote, how's the family? Oh, that's a lovely watch you have right there. That is a lovely, lovely watch. Wouldn't it be nice if you had another watch like that? Now, if you voted for me, you might have as many of those watches as you like. And see how intimidating and weird that felt? People would vote for him and just do what he asked because they were kind of weirded out by him. Yeah, see, Chip's a little scared of me now. But anyway, that's kind of how his general persona was. And he spent a bunch of time in the House and in the Senate getting to know everybody, getting to know the politics of it, the minutiae of it, relating to people, and having just an ability to charm you or threaten you, whichever it took to get his political ends. And a lot of that came from that time. He was also very... he's very willing to curse you out. He was probably our filthiest mouth president we've ever had. He was also very willing to intimidate you in very, very significant ways. Like, there were plenty of stories, Chip, of when he was eventually in the White House, where he would call aides over and have them just watch him take a piss. Yeah, I know, exactly. But he would do that because it would make it awkward for you. And he wanted to show dominance. That's just kind of how his personality was. While he's a senator, he actually sends a letter to Harry Truman in 1950 showing support for the Korean War. This unfortunately would set up a kind of a naivete on geopolitics and his lack of understanding about how the rest of the world worked. I'll get this out of the way right now. Lyndon Johnson was one of our best domestic policy presidents ever, but probably one of our worst foreign policy presidents ever. But we'll get to the details on that. He simply did not understand the Korean conflict, but he supported it just because he needed to support it politically. Johnson was very willing to tell you whatever you needed to hear so that you liked him and got on board with his policies. He was a big smoker, and in 1955 he ends up suffering a heart attack from that. He receives a moral support letter from then Senator Hubert Humphrey, eventually his future vice president, but they talk about that heart attack here. The heart attack kind of changes him a bit. He eventually is elected to Senate Majority Leader just before the heart attack, actually. But post-heart attack, like I said, it changed him. His outlook on the world became very different, and he became very much like his policy up to that point had been, I want power for the sake of power. And somebody basically told him, like, after the heart attack, like, what good would it have been to have all that power and die being the most powerful dead person? You didn't do anything good for anybody. that basically changes his mentality. And it happened at just the right time because obviously he assumes the Oval Office in only a few years. So here we get to the obvious 1960s. By then, he has decided he wants to run for the presidency because that's the real job that's going to be able to allow him to do change. And he's running over everybody. He's going to run away with this thing. If it weren't for this one kid from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, he could not get in Kennedy's way. Kennedy was just better at the running for president element of it, and Kennedy ultimately wins the nomination. Now, they end up deciding to put Lyndon Johnson in the vice presidency role. Probably the last time the vice presidency actually mattered in an election, because with Johnson, you would get Texas basically voting for Kennedy, which he absolutely needed. But he also hated that job because the vice presidency really has almost no responsibilities other than to break a tie in the Senate. We often think of it as like he's going to be an advisor, but that's not really an official role. We also think of it as, he's the guy who's a heartbeat away from the president, which is only a modern thing. It actually used to be that you had to have a separate election if that was the case, but that doesn't really matter for our purposes. Point is, he ends up being vice president and he hates the job, and he's constantly begging Kennedy, hey, let me have more power. Let me do more stuff. Let me be more involved. And the Kennedys in particular, especially Bobby Kennedy, couldn't stand Lyndon Johnson. They found him crass and awful and power mad. But they said, give him some token objectives. So they would send him to other countries to make speeches and stuff like that. But he really had no power. And he was just constantly complaining about how much he hated that role. But all the same, he was involved in some of these political decisions like the Cuban Missile Crisis. He obviously was involved. But then obviously everything changes on November 22nd, 1963 at about 1:30 p.m. When JFK is officially pronounced dead. About an hour later, Lyndon Johnson is sworn in to become the 36th president of the United States aboard Air Force One. Let's talk civil rights. Okay, it's time to do that. Now, the civil rights movement had been brewing really since the end of slavery in 1865, and it took forever, much longer than it should have. Ironically, because of the other President Johnson, Andrew Johnson held it up forever and really ruined an original opportunity. Regardless, when Kennedy dies, Johnson has to finish out his term, which was really only about a year and 2 months or so. And if he had lost the 1964 re-election, that would have been his entire presidency. It was like effectively 14 months. And he saw a political opportunity that was maybe once in a century, pretty much literally, which was the entire country was super sympathetic to what had happened to John F. Kennedy. And they saw Lyndon Johnson as the embodiment of stabilization. So Lyndon Johnson, being the strong, confident politician he was, saw an opportunity to finally get civil rights legislation through. In this brief time where he was going to have the presidency, he was just going to pressure Congress to do the right thing, to pass it. And there was an attempt by opposition, basically, opposition within his own party as well as opposing parties, to basically block it until a new election could come. That way civil rights wouldn't be passed, etc. And he said, no, this is ridiculous. This is an option. We can actually get this done. And he basically bullies everybody. And by the summer of 1964, it is finally passed. It lacks the teeth of the Civil Rights Bill, but it's massive in its achievement. And Lyndon Johnson got very lucky that he had Martin Luther King to work alongside him. The two of them worked in tandem, and they got it done. And it's weird to say that, John F. Kennedy was a big proponent of civil rights, but he didn't have the political capital to achieve it. He wanted it to be a thing, and Lyndon Johnson, very wisely so, not only saw a political opportunity to push it through, he also rebranded it as John F. Kennedy's dream. So were you to vote against it, he would just make you look like you were a monster who opposed, President Kennedy after his assassination, and just make you look terrible. So a lot of people voted for it out of peer pressure, but it worked, and it was the right thing to do. That, in a nutshell, kind of defines Lyndon Johnson as a president. He did a lot of really aggressive and, I would say, socially unacceptable things, but in an ends justify the means type of way. A lot of very, very good things came of effectively his bullying. And I know that's weird to think about, but that's what effectively happened. But he hated being an accidental president, and he really didn't want to be one. And so in 1964, he ran for re-election. He wasn't really expected to win, but he did, and he was very happy to have his own term. And in 1965, he gets the Civil Rights voting bill passed through. And that was his other major legislative achievement, the two of which, either one would have been huge. He got both. But unfortunately, this is also basically the foundation of the Vietnam War. I mean, you can argue Vietnam had a lot of other origin points, but this is where it gets really bad. I have a whole Vietnam section, so I'm going to kind of walk and talk while I do this. Here's what you guys need to know about Vietnam. Obviously, in 1965, it amps up under Lyndon Johnson. Let's talk about the origin point, though. Basically, post-World War II, in World War II, you had the death struggle between fascism. Obviously, that was Nazi Germany, not fascist Italy. You had, obviously, democratic Wests. We now refer to it almost as a capitalist society, being the Western powers like the United States. You had communism in the Soviet Union. And less talked about is the colonialism era, which is technically what Japan was. Things like the British Empire were like that, etc. And what happens out of World War II is that communism and Western democracy wins. Fascism is utterly and completely annihilated. And colonialism, because it was technically allied with the winners, it was allowed to survive barely. It was mostly phased out. Now, the reason that matters is that afterwards, the United States and the Soviet Union didn't agree on much, but they did agree colonialism had to die as it was the primary cause for the war. So when they both agreed on something, they basically gradually squeezed all the empires out, which is why the British Empire collapses formally in 1948, etc. Now, the reason any of that matters is you get to Vietnam. Now, Vietnam had been French Indochina. Guess who controlled it? That whole region of the world was controlled by France, and they were told, you got to go. And there's a French Civil War. There's a French war there and against the Vietnamese to basically hold it and retake power, but they weren't getting any support out of that, etc. Now, that's important because while in the United States, in particular, in a lot of the Western countries, we kind of think of a stable environment post-World War II. For a lot of these countries that used to be colonies, it wasn't stable. They didn't know what to do. And that's why a lot of countries were falling to communism, because it was kind of, let's say, enticing in almost a Sith-like way, as opposed to Jedi, if we were to use Star Wars here. And so a lot of these countries were like, well, the idea is that the government will come in and just control everything and then take care of the people. And on the surface, that sounds good, right? But there's way more complexity to that. And democracies are hard, but the potential benefits are far better. Once again, like a Jedi, like, yes, it's less tempting, but at the end, you're, kind of immortal, right? If you want to use that as a mentality. And so this happened with multiple countries. We talked about the Cuba stuff, obviously, in Kennedy's video, but Johnson is obviously more associated with Vietnam. So Vietnam kind of goes into its own situation where it's effectively split, kind of like North and South Korea are. There's a fully communist North Vietnam, and there's a South Vietnam that is trying to do the democracy thing, but it doesn't really have any regional support. And the French, who used to possess it, are basically looking at us like, are you really going to let this go? Because you have to remember the other geopolitical issue at the time was NATO. Now, NATO's foundation was basically that they wanted to keep the Russians from attacking the rest of Europe. And the reason they wanted to, the Americans in particular, didn't want all of Europe controlled by any one power. And we still have a maintained vested interest in Europe not becoming too powerful under one leader, because it's a direct threat to the United States. You can't hurt the United States if you can't access the Atlantic Oceans. You can't access the Atlantic Oceans if you can't control Europe. You can't control Europe unless you are a single dominating force. Hence, the United States has an interest in continuing to be there even now, and which is why we support things like the Ukrainians to keep the Russians out. That's still the basic foundation ever since World War II. In order for the United States to have security, the Russians can't have it. And in order for the Russians to have security, the Americans can't have it. It's the same struggle. It hasn't changed. Geography doesn't change, at least not enough. So at the time, in the 1960s, there was this belief that the United States wasn't doing enough to protect allies in Europe, that we were going to let Berlin fall, which we had almost done during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and especially post-Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy basically said, okay, we're not going to bother dealing with Cuba, we're not going to go in and invade it, we're going to let it exist, and we're also taking all of our military assets, for the most part, out of Turkey. It just looked like the United States was willing to trade its allies, which looked very bad. So you get to Vietnam, and the French are like, you're not going to protect them? You're not going to go in there? And so we did. That's where it starts. That's how it starts. And it just gets so much worse, because what ends up happening is we put in a couple of advisors, they slowly grow out, that slowly expands. We're like, look, we're just here to protect the South. We're not here to take down the North. We recognize the idea of two separate countries. The problem is we didn't understand, or at least Johnson didn't understand, that Vietnam was trying to unify ever since the First World War. It wanted to be just one place, and it didn't care what kind of ideology it was under. It just wanted to be one place. And Ho Chi Minh had selected communism because, again, Sith-like temptation. It was just easier. So Johnson basically says, okay, well, how do we deal with this? Let's just go in and support the South, do bombing raids in the North, and that's eventually what it gets to. But he basically is initially just trying to hold the line, just support the South, try to give them a stronger government, let them hold up, etc. It doesn't work. It just continues to expand. What eventually happens is that the Americans have bases there, and the bases keep getting hit by North Vietnamese forces, and so it's slow. Rather than the United States using the bases to then, it starts launching some bombing raids. And then we realize the South Koreans don't have the military assets to protect our bases. So we start gradually bringing troops in to do that. And then we realize the South Vietnamese forces can't resist the Northern forces, so we start doing it for them. And that mentality is just incremental. And it goes from this little thing where we're just trying to protect this southern country, or what we saw as a southern country, into a full-blown war. And it's in this time that he's able to, I think it's the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is mentioned here. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which we now know was largely a fabrication by the Johnson administration, was a minor thing where a day before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the CIA had actually tried to help the South do a couple of raids into North Vietnam. And so the North Vietnamese were on heightened alert. The USS Maddox goes within the Gulf of Tonkin the next day. They're still on high alert. They start shooting at the USS Maddox, which we used as a justification for basically the war. And then they made up the entire second incident. It is a whole thing. This isn't a Vietnam documentary. This is just the foundation of what happened. So that just keeps expanding. Like I said, gradual. And then it gets much worse. And they have the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which basically gives essentially war powers to the president, which is pretty much still in use, which is why we don't do formal declarations of war anymore. There hasn't been one since World War II. Yeah, a lot happened. A lot happened in this time. And by 1968, the whole situation is so ridiculously unpopular that Lyndon Johnson chooses not to run again, and Richard Nixon inherits the war. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the Richard Nixon Library, but he does technically end the war, and you got to give him credit for that. The thing with Johnson is he was a great domestic president who wanted to do so much. Like I said, civil rights he accomplished, civil rights, voting, Medicare, so many good things. He just didn't understand geopolitics at all. He did not understand what the Vietnamese wanted. And there was this arrogance of, well, if we just go in and knock out the North Vietnamese, they're not going to care. There's even famously, he had tried to offer a peace negotiation to North Vietnam. If you stop with your objectives, we'll come up with a whole great deal together. We'll be, friendly, whatever. He tried to do this whole thing, and he couldn't believe that Ho Chi Minh turned him down. But the reason Ho Chi Minh turned him down was just the simple truth. He's like, I don't care what we're united under. I want a united Vietnam, and we're all willing to fight and die for that. They basically, Vietnamese, had been at war for effectively 1,000 years. I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not. They fought the Chinese for centuries, and then they were fighting the French. And then in World War II, they were fighting the Japanese. And then when Japan lost the war, they were fighting the French again. And then they were fighting us. They never stopped. Vietnam did not see an end to hostilities until 1973 when the United States left. And they've been effectively on heightened alert ever since. Yeah, Vietnam War was complicated. I want to take a look here at map of Vietnam. Not specifically these dates or this objective, but this is the map of Vietnam. So North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and it was more or less split around there somewhere. Now, again, the United States kind of saw South Vietnam and North Vietnam as separate countries. They saw themselves as one thing that was just, they saw the South as just rebels that were being essentially held hostage, not only by the Americans, but by other forces, French forces, Western forces. They just wanted to be unified. Now, it's interesting because basically the United States won every single combat operation against the North and still lost the war. And it definitely lost in the sense that it didn't achieve its aims, but Vietnam was never a threat. It was never going to come over and destroy the United States, nothing like that. But the idea was, that they basically wanted the United States would operate only within South Vietnam. So ground troops would stay here and effectively play defense, which you can never win because if you're never going over there to stop the enemy from coming, you couldn't do that. So they would just ramp up bombing operations and just be like, let's come up with a peace, stop doing this. And the Johnson administration just really couldn't figure out how to get the North to come to the negotiation table. The Nixon administration eventually does, but that's because they amp up the bombing raids to an insane degree. And they eventually get them to agree in 1973 to, oh my God, it's over. We're surrendering. It's over. Okay. Anyway, whatever. We're leaving. It was not like a pointless paper, agreement. And then Saigon falls in 1975, 2 years later, when South Vietnam is kind of left to fend for itself. And yeah, that's in a nutshell pretty much what did it. So we're inside. This is actually the temporary exhibit, as it turns out, is this Vietnam stuff, which is good. You should keep this up as more of a thing. So I know you guys already saw this because we did a big B-roll walk around, which hilariously I walked in the reverse order. Sorry about that. That's okay. I would love to sit down and do like a comprehensive history of the Vietnam War type of video. This is not really the context for it, but I've given you guys some notes that I'm sure kind of paints it in a certain picture. But yeah, it basically by 1968, Lyndon Johnson is wildly unpopular, which really sucks because, like I said, he was a very good domestic president. But at that point, Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of the late John F. Kennedy, had made the decision that he was going to run for president. Now, in 1968, Lyndon Johnson was eligible for another term. And it's very uncommon historically for a sitting president to be challenged by runners in his own party, which they would have both been Democrats. But Bobby Kennedy was willing to do it, as were a few others. And Lyndon Johnson still had the option to run again. I like this little setup they have here. That's like a 1960s house. They tell you to sit down. And this speech comes on TV, the one you're seeing right there. So basically, Lyndon Johnson sits down with the country and does a speech to the nation where he just kind of tells them, like, here's the status of the Vietnam War. Here's everything that's going on. And then he just, towards the end of the speech, he just says, and tells the American people, like, he is not running for president again, even though he was eligible for another term. He would be the last president to be eligible for another term and choose not to run until Joe Biden in 2024, which is kind of impressive. Now, what makes him interesting, though, is he would have been the only, had he run again and won, he would have been the only president since the 22nd Amendment to serve more than 2 terms, because he completed Kennedy's term. Here's a fun thing about the 22nd Amendment. You can only serve 2 terms. That's how we always think of it. Technically, there's an extra 2-year leave, like an extra bit there that you can use in the event of an accidental presidency. So he inherited Kennedy's presidency, serves a full year, and then 2 months. Then he could have served his own term, which he did. Then he could have served another. So he theoretically could have been president for like almost 9.5 years, but that didn't happen. The last president we had that was also eligible for that was Gerald Ford, who completed Richard Nixon's. He could have run for another term. He did attempt to, but he did lose. Had he beaten Jimmy Carter in 1976, and then won again in 1980, Gerald Ford also could have been a president who been president for like 9.5 years. Technically, the same rule still is around. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama. Technically, any one of them can serve another 2 years, but they can't be elected to that position. So, like, if they ran as vice president and then inherited a presidency, they could continue being on that job for 2 years. Unlikely we will ever be in that scenario, though. But yeah, here it talks about the returning home and how a lot of veterans, because the war was so unpopular, it created a huge social divide amongst the American people because nobody really understood why we were over there. Because the geopolitical reason for us being there was proved kind of defunct. And even the public reason of like, oh, we can't stop the spread of communism, etc. Yes, that was a legitimate concern, but it was hard to justify to the American people, especially with so many people coming back dead. About 68,000 Americans died in that war. However, people don't talk too much about the Vietnamese numbers. They lost over 2 million. It was bad and ultimately pointless, as Saigon would fall in 1975 anyway. Vietnam and the United States have started to, like, the two countries get along now. We're still not exactly what you'd call allies, but they are starting to rebuild relations over a mutual distrust of the Chinese. So there's that. Now, to the Johnson Library's credit, it has a whole section on the vets that were lost and about this Vietnam Wall that's still in Washington, D.C. And this will forever be the thing Lyndon Johnson is sadly associated with, despite being the unbelievable domestic president that he was. He famously would walk around the White House saying, how many more boys died today? People would stand outside the White House and protest, LBJ, how many boys did you kill today? Stuff like that. And yeah, unfortunately for history, and especially for him, it was his war and he had to own it. Its roots went all the way back to World War I, believe it or not. It was just, geopolitics is fascinating because basically when you understand your own country's national security desires, but you also understand the security desires of other countries, it's relatively easy to predict certain things. Vietnam, like any country, was going to be worried about its own security. And that eventually led it down a certain path that the United States went down as well. And eventually that led to the two of them hitting each other. You can think of them like lines on a map eventually crossing. And that's where you have conflict. I know it seems grossly oversimplified, but honestly, kind of true. To the museum's credit, they have a box of tissues here in case you've become emotional, because we're at the point now where we're reaching presidential libraries where a lot of the people who grew up during this era are actually here. Like, we have actual Vietnam vets walking around, and so this gets very emotional for them. So back out in the main room, we talk more about the timeline. 1968, often considered the worst year in American history. Obviously, the Vietnam War got to its absolute heights. Global political violence was on the rise. The U.S. was not doing well. This was the assassination of Martin Luther King. So shortly after Johnson decides not to run again, which was already weird psychologically for the American people, that happens, the death of Martin Luther King. Then the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, the election of Richard Nixon, a lot of just bad stuff going on. Soviet Union invades Czechoslovakia, which barely ever talked about. Like, 68 was a tumultuous year. But, I mean, it's, there were good things. This doesn't get talked about much. Sesame Street and PBS, that was actually a creation of Lyndon Johnson. He created public broadcasting system and got it on TV. It barely, it technically started in the Nixon years, but it was an initiative that was created by him. And it hadn't been around too long before Richard Nixon actually was going to try to axe it because he just didn't see the point of funding it. But technically that was a decision to be made by the House of Representatives. And they were dead set on destroying it because the Republicans had kind of run in a wave in 1968 on the unpopularity of Lyndon Johnson. And what's interesting is the only reason you have public broadcasting television still, things like Sesame Street and all that, is because when this was up for debate, Mr. Rogers, like TV's Fred Rogers, he went before the Congress to give a speech. And they actually have a bit about this at the Smithsonian. He basically sits down with these like hard-lined right-wing Republicans who are just like, no, there's no government funding for television. That's stupid. He sits down with them and convinces them on national television. They just kind of surrender and go, he's too good of a man. We have to support this. There's too many people that need this. So you got to get, the only reason this still exists is because of Fred Rogers. But yeah, they have more about his, basically they talk about his very brief post-presidency. He leaves office on January 20th, 1969. They have some other events like the moon landing and all that stuff. His post-presidency was comically short. He did have a direct hand in this place, in the facility we're in right now. It was unveiled in 1971. And he dies only in 1972. He died on January 22nd, 1973. The interesting fact, by the way, had he run for that third term, and had he won, and had he died the same day, he would have been a former president for 2 days. Only 2 days, because his term would have ended January 20th, 1973, if he had won in 1968. So yeah, he only had a 4-year post-presidency, 4-year and 2-day post-presidency. And the only real accomplishment of that time, other than a couple of speeches, was that he unveiled the place we're in now. Lady Bird Johnson, his former first lady, she lived all the way to 2007. She's currently buried next to him in their cemetery, which is actually not here. Most presidential libraries, the president that is associated with it is buried at the library. John F. Kennedy was the first one not to be, but that's because he was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson is the only one that actively made the choice not to be buried at his library. He's buried about an hour and a half away. We'll go scope it out later. Spoilers. And Jimmy Carter, who is still alive at the time of this recording, has decided not to be buried at his library. He will be buried in Plains, Georgia. But yeah, they unveiled a bunch of his recordings in 2008. And yeah, just new permanent exhibits. But yeah, they don't have much to say about his post-presidency just because it was very, very brief. So as I mentioned before, the Johnson treatment, he would intimidate people, get right up in their space and everything. So they gave you the option to take a photo with Lyndon Johnson scaring the hell out of you. All right, we're going to leave the 3rd floor and head up to the 4th floor. And when you go up here, the first thing you'll see is this. Now, this is the presidential library part. Now, I probably have never made this really clear in any of these videos, maybe a little bit, maybe the Eisenhower one. So these aren't just museums. They're museums and libraries. The reason they're called libraries is because you see all those red things? Those are actually books, or well, pallets more accurately, containing all of his official presidential paperwork. This is for historians to come and see. And apparently, Lady Bird Johnson basically said what she didn't like about the other libraries at the time is that there was a different entrance for the public versus researchers. So like Eisenhower's is 2 separate buildings, for example. Truman's was kind of hidden in the back. FDR's was in the basement. I didn't even notice where Hoover's was. But anyway, she was like, I want the public to come in and just see the library, see the history. And I totally agree with that sentiment. So Lady Bird Johnson was actually responsible for that. There's also this gigantic presidential seal, which is a little hard to see, but it's there. Massive. And down here, I don't know if this is a temporary exhibit or if this is just more about the civil rights. It's obviously about the civil rights. I don't know if this is temporary or not. It requests not to take photos in there, so I'll just kind of give you a quick look at it. But there you go. So you can leave that area and then you get out to what's called the sculpture garden. Here we have one of FDR. And if you go further down, they have this really good one of Chip. And it's actually sentient, it moves and everything. It's like a robot thing, but yeah, that's a really good sculpture. It looks just like him, except for the glasses. He never wears those. I don't know what's up with that. But then over here, they have another one of course, Lyndon Johnson, which makes perfect sense that that would be there. And then he's doing that intimidating point he would always do. All right, so in a second, we're going to check out LBJ's presidency, but we have a mural out here with, of course, LBJ a couple of times, obviously here with Kennedy, him with Eisenhower, him with Harry Truman, and him with FDR. He was a young man who, like, these are all the different presidents he had met at one point. There is actually photos of him as a young man when he met FDR. It's a common trend, actually, particularly with Democratic presidents, where when they're young, they meet a future president, etc. So like there's actually a photo of Bill Clinton meeting John F. Kennedy. And we even now have, although Eisenhower, of course, also, you know, a Republican, but in this era, he met him too. But then by that point, he was working in government. We will now enter the LBJ presidential section. So here they show him and Lady Bird in 2 different eras, pretty much just as they're getting to Washington and pretty much on their way out of Washington. Unless that's the inaugural ball. It could be, I don't actually know. But here in this section, they talk way more about Lyndon Johnson's early political life as a congressman and as a senator, the path to the presidency, as they call it. And they just kind of show more of the general context of how the country was when he was running for various offices. Again, there he is with Dwight Eisenhower. There, obviously, with Kennedy. His life in politics and just the general state of the country as it was. The different titles he had held. So congressional aide, he was congressman, U.S. senator, Senate majority whip, Senate minority leader, Senate majority leader, vice president, and then obviously through the presidency itself. The world as it was through LBJ's eyes. Here they talk about basically the 1950s and what he was doing and his views on the world and communism and things like the Little Rock incident, you know, with segregation and how that was being handled. Obviously, the eventual Cuban Missile Crisis dilemma, let's put it that way, mildly. But yeah, the Berlin Wall being on the rise and his eventual rise from, you know, the Senate to being JFK's running mate. And yeah, he gets that, obviously, as we discussed before. And then here's where they do a robust section on the day he became president of the United States, November 22nd, 1963. Of course, the Kennedy assassination, as we discussed. This is a more robust section on the Kennedy assassination than anywhere in JFK's own library, which is really bizarre. And here they have something kind of interesting. This is the actual articles of clothing that Johnson was wearing at the time of the assassination, the time he was inaugurated, and that's what Lady Bird Johnson was wearing. So that's what he's wearing there in that photo, is also what they actually have on display here, which is surreal to see. And that's the Bible he was sworn in on. His hand is got right there, is right there. Yeah. and a note. And then he comes out. Once they land in Dallas, he makes a speech and everything. I apologize for the noise. I can't control any of that. But yeah, so that's the original articles of clothing. So he achieves the presidency in an accidental way, which he did not like. As I mentioned before, he does eventually run on his own term and succeeds, but he had reframed successfully, talks to joint session of Congress, does the whole thing where, you know, he's mourning the loss of JFK. He actually lets Jackie Kennedy stay in the White House for a week or so to kind of get herself together without kicking her out. But interestingly, yeah, so he basically, as I mentioned before, he takes the passing of JFK as a political opportunity to get civil rights passed because it was something JFK had wanted. So he reframes it to being like, you have to do this for JFK, and the Senate just couldn't find the votes to oppose that mentality, and that's how civil rights gets through. He works with former President Dwight Eisenhower on some things. He meets up with Harry Truman. He actually famously goes out to the Truman Library on a desk to sign in certain Medicare and Medicaid rights. Like I said, incredibly good domestic president, terrible foreign policy president. And here's where he's talking about fulfilling America's promises. You know, he believed, like I said, he was the last of what they called the New Deal Democrats, which was FDR's whole thing about how the government can help. There's government aid and there's government overreach. And he believed in government aid, creating certain types of programs that basically help the greater good of society so you can avoid things like serfdom. Because if people are just so desperate and destitute, that's how fascist states rise. That's how communist states rise. He wanted to avoid that. Now here they have the whole the bus incident in Rosa Parks. They have a recreation. The real bus, by the way, I've shown you in a video. It's actually in the museum in Detroit, Dearborn, Michigan. I've actually sat in the Rosa Parks seat. So if you're seeing it, it's because I cut away to it. But either way, we've actually got that. So that happened in his time. And it was, again, civil rights, big thing. It was probably the crown jewel of his presidency. But like I said, he cared a lot about making sure that people were fed and that people had jobs, and he was trying to push the working man to any working man who wants a job can get a job. So this section expands on those things like Civil Rights Act. Like I said, that deserves multiple movies made about it. And this photo was very strategic after it was, you know, the story of this and how this actually happened and all the people who voted for it, and this photo taken where Lyndon Johnson is the last in the line to make it become law. It's Martin Luther King strategically placed right behind him, etc. The Voting Rights Act only a year later, etc. And it expands on all these things about civil rights, which I don't consider myself any sort of expert on, but it's obviously a very good story. I believe this is the desk he used to sign the Voting Rights Act, is here. I like how some of the presidential libraries do this. And here's where they talk about some of the subtler but very significant achievements. Obviously, Voting Rights Act, as we discussed, here were his goals for what they call the Great Society he had envisioned. And so, you know, I'm just going to read some of these, like enrich and elevate our national life, advance the quality of our American civilization, make progress the servant of our needs, etc. There was just so much that he wanted to do, a lot of which he did get to do, but because he didn't end up completing his presidency, because he didn't run for that extra term, you know, he just couldn't do it. Oh, the desk right there. That's what I was talking about. This actual desk is at the Harry Truman Library because that's Harry Truman right there. And Johnson had just envisioned a more productive, better America where everybody who wants to work has a job, where people aren't starving, where poverty is phased out, and you could just genuinely help America, help the people not only to live, but to live better, to be productive. And that's where things like the arts, the National Endowment for the Arts basically came from him. Things like I said, PBS came from him. A greater expansion into things like the National Park Service to preserve those treasures for future generations. But by inviting creativity in the arts, telling people that can be a job, you were able to create art forms, movies and all that sort of stuff, all were born of that kind of support. Obviously, update on healthcare and Social Security, more on education. Again, he's such an anomaly because he tried to work on immigration as well. It's like, here's the legislative achievements: civil rights, voting rights, fair housing, immigration, war on poverty, Department of Housing and Urban Development, aid to Appalachia. Like, obviously it goes on and on and on and on, but that's my point. Probably one of the greatest legislative presidents we ever had, but not good at foreign policy. Did he make a difference? Yes, absolutely. Here they talk about the expansion of the space race. Now, Kennedy gets a lot of credit for this, as does Nixon. Johnson is often not talked about much, which is funny because the Johnson Space Center is still a thing. This is an actual chunk of the moon rock. Johnson had a lot to do with the Apollo landing missions. It's just that he wasn't president when they were actually, completed and made it to the moon. Nixon was. And it was obviously famously Kennedy's dream to go there. Johnson was very good at kind of giving Kennedy credit for it because he knew that's how you would actually get it accomplished. Oh, I forgot Bewitched started during this presidency, as did I Dream of Jeannie, to be fair. But yeah, these are a lot of the infamous space incidents that occurred during his presidency, and he made sure that they were getting funding to continue that initiative because it was important not only to defeat the Soviets, but also to push the general sense of technology that came of it, because that technology isn't just for going to the moon. It can be used in everyday things, including the phone I am currently recording all of this was largely born of the space race. The Cold War, obviously they try to talk about that. He, again, was not a great geopolitical president, so he's not really known for any of this. He just kind of had a tolerate the Soviet Union type of mentality, wanted to contain communism, didn't have any great plan for how to stop it. And his mentality, I guess, to some extent, was obviously Vietnam. They were tolerating Cuba, tolerating all this stuff because they didn't know what else to do about it. It just wasn't where his heart was. His heart was all in civil government and, domestic politics. They talk about the Cold Warrior president. Obviously, he technically was because he was president during the Cold War, but that really wasn't where he was at, as we know from the Vietnam War. What's this? He used pens to sign. Oh, these are pens he used to sign into different laws. Food for Freedom Act, the Emergency Assistance to India Act. Just, again, general good. But some of those are his version of Cold Warriors. So like India, for example, helping them out meant they wouldn't necessarily fall to communism or fall to the Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera. That's his version of Cold Warrior, is improve the lives of the people in that country. And if you do that, they won't go to communism. But actually trying to stop a communist nation, not really his forte. The 6-Day War, they have a section here about that, which is largely about when Syria, Egypt, and some other Arab states attacked Israel, kind of with the behest of at the behest, if you will, of the Soviet Union, or at least with their support, and the United States kind of had to deal with it, and he wanted to do everything possible to make sure the United States wasn't dragged into it, because they did not want to be fighting the Soviet Union directly. Proxy wars, I'm sure you've heard this term. I mean, Israel wins that one resoundingly. Unfortunately, as you know, based on modern times, not a lot has changed over there. Russians are still interfering in Israel, as are we in the Middle East. It's just, that's the thing about geopolitics, like I was talking about before. Russian security and American security basically depend upon the other one never having it. You can learn a lot by studying geopolitics and history, because you'll be able to predict where stuff goes, because unfortunately the geography doesn't change, and because the geography doesn't change, motives never change. Everybody cares about their security, and unfortunately, that overlaps. Now up here, they have a whole section on Vietnam, but since I think we've sufficiently talked about that, we aren't going to do much more of it. But yeah, there's that. They have all these little phones throughout where you can hear Lyndon Johnson talk about something, in this case, India and Pakistan to fight in Kashmir, which is still an ongoing conflict, actually. Yeah, they're talking, again, more about the domestic policy, obviously Vietnam issues, the draft, which Lyndon Johnson had famously promised they were never going to do a draft. And then he had no choice, and he had to do a draft, which only made the war more unpopular. Here, this is a famous photo of Lyndon Johnson basically declaring you can't get out. Now, the White House recording system still existed at this point, so we have a lot of great audio from this era of what was actually going on behind the scenes, etc. And Lyndon Johnson just did not know how to deal with this. Again, great domestic president, terrible at foreign policy. He did not know what the Vietnamese wanted. He did not understand that culture. And so he couldn't come up with a peace resolution. He also didn't want to be the first U.S. president to lose a war. Especially after so many had died for what was seemingly pointless. He just didn't have the geopolitical skill for it because he did not know how to negotiate with them. If he had found a way to basically go to the North Vietnamese and be like, look, we agree, let's unify Vietnam, and rather than do it with bombs and bullets, why don't we do it with democracy? He probably could have won that argument, but he didn't know how to present it because he didn't understand that it wasn't meant to be two countries. And so as a result, it all blows up too far. And as we mentioned before, this is where he decides not to run for another term. This one is interesting because the only modern comparison we have to it is when Joe Biden decided not to run again in 2024. But this one was different. See, Joe Biden, when he did it, it became an entire speech about that. This one, Lyndon Johnson, he's talking about Vietnam, and he just kind of randomly throws it at the very end, like, oh, by the way, I'm not running again. So it's very different. And he was eligible for another term, as I said. That's a very rare thing. I think the last one-term president who chose not to run, and I say one term because he did complete Kennedy's, you have to go all the way back to like James Buchanan. Like it goes back a minute until Joe Biden. So yeah, then just more stuff about 1967. Nation responds to Lyndon Johnson, not running for president again. More about pop culture as it was at the time. It's kind of a weirdly laid out. Honestly, it's kind of strangely laid out. But 1968, as we already mentioned, it was expected at that point that Bobby Kennedy was going to win the White House. And Lyndon Johnson famously said his worst fear was being, quote, the mistake in between the Kennedy brothers, which, to be fair, and Chip will tell me all about this too, because he'll totally agree with me, so he's pointing, so that means it's true. Had Bobby Kennedy not been killed, he probably would have won the election in 1968. We don't know. Obviously, there's no way to know that. But had he won, Johnson probably would have been seen as the warmonger president in between the Kennedys, which has terrified him. But anyway, so he has this farewell to the nation, as is common. Most presidents do that, at least modern presidents. And then he has a relatively short post-presidency, as we discussed before. So unfortunately, this doesn't get to happen for us. So the 10th floor, which we mentioned before, is where the Oval Office and life in the White House and some of this stuff, the First Lady's Gallery, because like most presidential libraries have a section for the First Lady. All that's up on the 10th floor, and we can't go to it. We asked why, like what the construction is, and they're like, asbestos. It's like old construction. It has to be removed, so that's what's happening. It could take years. We're like, oh, that sucks. But all the same, here you go to the sunset of the presidency, of his former presidency, on the ranch, which maybe, we'll go out and show you a little bit of. So I was just thinking about this. Like upstairs, they have that mural where he's with all the different presidents. One president they don't ever show him with was actually Richard Nixon. And the reason I bring that up is when this place opened, the only other living U.S. president was Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon actually was cool enough to come out here for the unveiling. So it was just Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon is... just put a photo of them, the two of them here. I mean, he was cool enough to come out here for you. And I don't say this as any big Richard Nixon fan. I just like the complete story. We're going to go in here. The most important thing, the gift shop. I'll see if we can find any interesting things here to show you. Well, so far we found one very good thing. This is the Texas-sized pencil, which is mostly for like murdering people. I mean, look at this thing. So this is actually something you can find out on this ranch, or at least originally. They've obviously done recreations, but that in a nutshell says how Lyndon Johnson spoke. This is actually a very good quote. It's not politics, it's history. That pretty much explains everything we're talking about here. If you're not into politics, that's cool. You don't have to be. Neither am I. I'm into history, I'm into geopolitics. Politics sucks. Chip, look, snack time with the Obamas. That's really random, but it is next to a bunch of candy. I guess that's cool.
Astronaut,
No, here's the thing with that astronaut thing. This thing is bull. Like, it seems like, Johnson Space Center, Kennedy Space... They sell this at everyone. They were selling this at, like, the Hoover one. You had nothing to do with space. This is a lie. I think they just mass-produce these and send them to every single one of the libraries. And if you got a headache while you're in here, they got you covered. And with that, we are out of the gift shop, which is over there. You get that big Lyndon Johnson statue back there. That's kind of a little creepy, but whatever. We did that. So, Chip, was this your first presidential library?
It was.
What did you think of it? What was it like? What can you tell the people?
It was big and empty. It was interesting.
Texas, big and empty.
Yeah, like that building, there was a lot more empty space than I was expecting.
Yeah, to be fair, that's partially how they designed it. They wanted it to stand out and be big and Texas-like. But there's a lot of space in there that's not used. To be fair, the 10th floor was shut down, which does really suck. But let's give some final thoughts here. As far as on the presidential library scales, this is a good one. It is not one of the better ones, nor is it one of the worst ones. I don't really like the presentation style. When you walk in, they have this like kind of abridged timeline of things. And that's what I was trying to show you, like, oh, wow, we're just like really cutting through this.
Yeah.
Then there's that temporary exhibit, which is apparently temporary. There's the whole big section on Vietnam, which I had liked, and usually it's better than most of the temporary exhibits. Most of the temporary exhibits suck. That one was actually good, but the fact that it's temporary is weird. So it kind of
introduces you to Lyndon Johnson and kind of concludes Lyndon Johnson in the same area. Like, it starts off like he wasn't president, then he was president, then he's not president, and bye. Like, you're right into the gift shop. I didn't really like that format.
Definitely glossed over details that I would have liked more
Yeah.
information on. Also, even just the timeline itself, it didn't go in the order I expected. It would be like, here's 1964, then back to then to 65, then back to 64. And it was a little hard to read and follow.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't like that too much. The second floor, I was nicer. I liked the what Lady Bird was going for, where you can see the presidential archives.
That was
and all
great.
That was good. And that LBJ presidency, that section is way, way better. Like, you don't start with the lower level. Why would you do that? And I can't judge the 10th floor, but I do have to obviously give it this, we have to cut points off just because it was inaccessible to us.
Yep.
As a bonus to the Presidential Library's video, we're going to continue here. We're now in Johnson City, Texas. Chip's very excited about this. We're at the Boyhood home of Lyndon Johnson, which is this White House here. We're on the ranch is nearby. We're going to go scope some of that out, as well as the final resting place of the 36th president, which is out here. House is still something you can actually do a tour of. However, it's going to close in a few minutes, and we didn't pay to do this, but we just thought we'd give you a quick little look at it. You want to open that door for me real quick there? No. You can't. It's locked. Well, then never mind. I remember one of those old phones. I had one of those. I'm that old, really. They let us inside, so you can get a quick look at the decor of the house that Lyndon Johnson grew up in. His father, as we had mentioned once before, was actually a representative of Texas at one point, and Lyndon Johnson learned a lot about the presidency, politics, in this house. And there's one of those hats he would famously wear. Got a room out here, not really sure. Just this area seems nice enough. And here would be the kitchen. They would spend their time obviously preparing food in. I don't know how much of this is original and how much it isn't, but it's very neat. Out here, I guess, would be the closest thing to a living room, which of course had modern day Vornados in it. No, just a joke. But yeah, so these are kind of the humble living conditions that the 36th president of the United States came from. And as you can see, there's an active tour group in here. Off of this room, you can see access to the parents' bedroom and the boys' bedroom. He would grow up there, and the parents would pay attention to him to make sure he wasn't causing a lot of issues. And then they have a back porch, and you can see out onto the yard as it was, which is now the visitor center up there. So this would be the room that Lyndon Johnson once slept in as a child. I think it's illustrated there with a glove mitt, and there's actually a photo of him back there. And that's pretty cool. And outside, his bathtub, I guess. So we are now on the grounds of the LBJ Ranch. We'll show you some of that stuff. It's about 20 minutes away from Johnson City. Right here, this is the birthing house of Lyndon Johnson. He was born in this. You got to remember, this is an era where presidents were actually born in these little houses. The first one born in a hospital was actually Jimmy Carter. And Reagan and Bush 41 were also born in like childhood homes. It wasn't until Bill Clinton that it was standard for a president to be born in a hospital, as weird as that sounds. So this whole vast area is the LBJ Ranch. However, the main exhibition center over there is under construction, so the only thing you can really see is this, often referred to as Air Force 1.5. Lyndon Johnson, I know, kind of had this, like a smaller plane basically designed so that, he could come in and out of here while he was living here. And they actually built like a airport strip. I think that's sort of what this road eventually got turned into. But the whole idea is that he could just land and take off from what they now call the Texas White House, where he would come down and do work, bring dignitaries. Sadly, we can't show you any of that stuff. I would have loved to, but as I said, it's under construction. The other thing they have there, they have some of his vehicles, because he would love to drive all around here. And you might have noticed when we were driving around, there's like little lakes. Sorry, we didn't show you that. We didn't think this was going to come to such an abrupt end. But he also had he had a duck boat. Chip, what's a duck boat?
I don't see anything.
Yeah, he doesn't know what duck boats are. This is an old joke between him and me. He denies the existence of duck boats. But what duck boats are is like a little car that's amphibious. So you could take it and drive it in the water. So one of the things Lyndon Johnson would do is he would bring out politicians and dignitaries and stuff. And if he wanted someone, especially like congressmen, to vote on something, he'd be like, come on down to the ranch, we'll hang out, and be very affable. And if they were difficult with him, he would take them for a drive in his duck boat car. And then once they made him sufficiently angry, he would drive it into the lake and be like, that's it, we're done. And he would just like, they would think they were about to die, but it was a boat. And then he'd be like, oh hell, son, I'm not really gonna kill us, just vote for the damn bill. And they would be like, all right. But yeah, anyway, like I said, we'd love to show you more, but sadly this is what we are limited to. The color scheme on there, the modern day Air Force One color scheme, was actually designed by Jackie Kennedy. So that lives on.
Bonus time. This is the Air Force One used by President Lyndon Johnson during his term in office. It is also the same vehicle in which he was sworn into the presidency to assume to be the 36th president of the United States after the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
You can actually see that frame behind me is also right there, visible right there in that photo. And he was standing basically about here. A little bit further in, but they've obviously got this walled off. So the last thing we're going to show you here is the Johnson Family Cemetery, which is locked up for no apparent reason. But right there in the middle, and now the Sega Pluto has been to the final resting place of the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson. If you guys do me a favor in all seriousness, you could like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all the social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, Travel Channel, which is obviously this, so other videos as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.